Hello and welcome. Is there a crack in America's powerful pro-Israel lobby? The very public disagreement between President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over settlement construction has some Washington observers wondering how much influence such groups might still have. The U.S. is widely recognized as Israel's strongest ally, with disagreement between the two rare and usually in private when it does happen. Until now, Israel has always been able to rely on its strong supporters in the U.S. Congress to help persuade the White House on any contentious issues. However, on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's last visit to Washington, there were signs that this could all be changing. Mr. Netanyahu was reportedly taken aback when a number of U.S. congressmen began challenging him on Israel's settlement construction and backed President Obama's call for a halt. On today's show, we look at the makeup of those charged with promoting Tel Aviv's interests in America and ask, what is the new face of the pro-Israel lobby in America? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part. And we'll welcome your phone calls on the show too. Well, joining our conversation is Dan Fleshler, media consultant and writer based in New York. He sits on the advisory council for J Street, a relatively young pro-Israel organization which supports a, quote, new direction for U.S. Middle East policy. Mr. Fleshler has just published Transforming America's Israel Lobby, the Limits of Its Power and the Potential for Change. And from Jerusalem, we're joined by Mitchell Barak, a former aide to Benjamin Netanyahu and speechwriter for Ariel Sharon. Mr. Barak is also the founder and CEO of the Israeli research firm Kivun. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. And Dan Fleshler, starting with you, what sort of division is there now among Americans lobbying for Israel, based out of America? How significant is that division?
Well, there is what I call the conventional Israel lobby, the more traditional organizations that are bound and determined to close any distance between Israeli and American policy and have not done a particularly active job, needless to say, of changing the situation that most of the world finds appalling, the occupation of Palestinian territory and the problems between the two peoples. There are other voices in the American Jewish community that have always been there, and more recently they have started to coalesce and been heard a little bit more loudly than they've been heard in the past. And they believe that the United States needs to be more even-handed, more balanced, and to have the capacity to lean on both sides of the conflict rather than just one side. Right. Those voices have not been loud enough yet, nor do they have quite the resources as the conventional Israel lobby. But the Obama administration understands there's a multiplicity of views within the American Jewish community in a way that other administrations have not ever had before.
Dan, let me ask you though, it's interesting to read your comments in your new book, Transforming America's Israel Lobby, that you feel that the pro-Israel lobby in America has been dragged along to follow conservative changes in Israeli politics, and that the roots of the lobby movement are actually more tied towards a more pragmatic view among Israeli leaders prior to Menachem Begin. So if that's the case, why hasn't anyone moved away from the more hardline shift in Israel here in the US then? Earlier, that is.
Well, it's a very complicated question. A lot of it has to do with the fact that those who lean towards the left on this issue, which is to say who are opposed to the occupation and are concerned about the settlements among American Jews, this doesn't tend to be their main political issue. They tend to be multi-issue voters. So this isn't their main focus of voluntary activity. Whereas those who support the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and other organizations that lean towards to the right, this tends to be their main activity. So they're louder, they're more raucous, and frankly, they devote more money to this cause. A lot of it is purely pragmatic and concrete in terms of the sort of how the two sides line up against each other. Another factor, though, is fear among left-leaning, more dovish American Jews that they don't want to be contributing to an atmosphere of hostility towards Israel in general. There's a certain level of conformity that has always kicked in. All of those are things I address in my book. I think all of that has changed now. And it certainly changed after 9/11 when it became clear that not only is it in Israel's interests to stabilize, to have the region stabilized, not only is it in the Palestinians' interest, but it's in American interest. Okay. And so there are those of us who feel there's no contradiction between being pro-Israeli, pro-American, and pro-Palestinian. And that's who you're hearing from more frequently now in Washington.
Okay. Mitchell Barak, good to have you with us there from Jerusalem as well. And you were born in America. Now, I guess a lot of people wonder, pleasure, where should loyalties lie of American Jews? Should they be with Israel first or America first? Because, should they be considering loyalty to America over Israeli policies?
They should absolutely be considering the United States of America. And to the best of my knowledge, AIPAC, since its founding, I guess in the 1950s, has been doing just that. And they've been promoting the America-Israel relationship and trying to strengthen that relationship. And the bottom line is every time that they talk to a congressman or a senator or the administration, what they're trying to convince them is that it's in the best interest of the United States of America to have a very strong relationship with Israel.
Now, I gather your organization, Kivun, surveyed Israelis and found that those in Israel believe that American Jews should prioritize, and go basically in accordance with the views of Israel. To what extent do you feel there is scope? Should there be any questioning of decisions made in Israeli policy, even if they contradict the direction America is taking?
I think there are. I mean, I think at the end of the day, many of the lobbying organizations do not go hand in hand with the Israeli government. I think a lot of the policies that they support are what the Israeli government wants. And I think there's also some not coordination, but the lobbying organizations in the U.S. are also explaining to the Israeli lawmakers, and I've seen this, what the American administration or American congressmen, what's important to them. And they're trying to bridge the gaps from both aspects.
We had a couple of live station questions. We've got a live station chat room going as we go live. And Dan, if I could put this to you from Nasser in Algeria, who's in the chat room, who asks, for more than 60 years, the U.S. has supported Israel. Do you think Obama will bring any change without ignoring AIPAC?
Well, Obama can't ignore AIPAC. No one can ignore AIPAC. The question is, does he have enough political leeway and wiggle room to take a different approach that is less skewed towards one side of the conflict? I think history has shown that any American president who actually wants to do that and is willing to stand up to more right-wing forces in the American Jewish community, in fact, has been able to do it. Carter was able to do it. The first George Bush was able to do it to some extent, even Clinton. So I don't think it's a question of ignoring AIPAC. AIPAC is going to be a rather powerful force, but the only question is, does an American president have the political leeway and the understanding to have a more independent position?
Okay.
In fact, I don't think AIPAC is particularly interested in a confrontation with this president. A wildly popular president with the support of the vast majority of American Jews, a Democratic majority in Congress. This is not a group that wants to have a fight, and that's something that is to Barack Obama's advantage on this front.
Mitchell, this also came from the chat room as well, also from Nigeria. One of our viewers then there, Huck in Nigeria, says, do you think Obama can turn his back on AIPAC? What are the consequences likely to be?
Well, I think that there's a very broad support for Israel and Israeli policies in the Congress and Senate. And we're concentrating on the pro-Israeli lobby, and we're just assuming here that it's only Jewish groups. And that's really not the case. There's a very large evangelical community that have started their own lobby organization. And there are a lot of evangelical Christians in the U.S., many, many millions of them, that are even far to the right of AIPAC and all the other Jewish organizations in their support of Israel and their support, for instance, of the settlements and building in the settlements. So the support for Israel, I believe, is very entrenched in both the Congress and Senate, and it's bipartisan. And I think that's something that AIPAC has said all along, that they have bipartisan support for what they do, and they try and influence both Republicans and Democrats. So I think it's going to be very hard for the administration to change a lot of that support. At the same time, I think that there is some willingness to have a new direction and to have someone who's very motivated to try and not impose a peace agreement, but to try and jumpstart it. And I think President Obama has been successful in trying to do that. I think it's been helpful that there's a new prime minister and a new government in Israel, the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu came out in a very formal policy speech at Bar-Ilan University, where for the first time a Likud prime minister or Netanyahu came out in favor of a two-state solution. And that's a very big move. And Netanyahu is also talking about modifying some of the settlement policy, not freezing it at all, So there is some movement on the Israeli side, and I think what Israelis are looking to see is if the Obama administration can not only push Israel, but push some of the Arab countries as well to normalizing relations with Israel.
Okay, we've got Aidan on the line from Norway.
Could I jump in and respond?
Sorry, Dan, give us 1 second. Let's just get to Aidan's question from Norway, and then I'll get a response from you. Aidan, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, people seem to have a very short memory. This man, Netanyahu, there's a lot of dishonesty associated with him, and corruption, tax and other financial matters, not so very long ago historically. And I mean, as far as policy towards the Middle East, towards the occupied zone goes, this has gone on for 60 years, and the Israeli policy has been characterized by bad faith, talks about talks, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and this man Netanyahu, the insincerity absolutely ripples off his face. He recently spoke in support of the Iranian demonstrations, and and it was absolutely hypocritical to say that.
Aidan, I'm going to actually ask Mitchell Bragg to respond on this. Mitchell, you've worked closely with Benjamin Netanyahu. How do you address some of the comments there made by Aidan in Norway?
Well, I think they're just factually incorrect. I don't know that he had any tax evasion or corruption charges. He had one investigation launched against him when he was prime minister for using a storage facility without paying. He was cleared of those charges. There were nothing filed against him. There are a lot of other Israeli ministers and politicians who were indicted or who were convicted of crimes, but that's not the case. And you're talking about a very broad-based government, a national unity government that he's in charge of, which has parties which are to the right of the Likud and parties as far to the left as Labor. And he's got to maintain that balance, and it's not easy to maintain that balance. And sometimes you have to make 2 steps forward and 1 step back in order to keep moving forward. Okay. And I think he's done that. And there are people that have criticized some of the language that he used in his speech on the right, meaning that he spoke about support of a 2-state solution, a Palestinian state, and then there are people on the left that said he didn't go far enough. So I think when you have that kind of criticism coming from both the left and right, he's trying to maintain his government, and I think he will be somewhat successful. It will depend on how the partners in his government will accept moving forward.
Dan, let's get your response. I'm sorry you had to wait there, but also let's get your response on how sincere you think Benjamin Netanyahu can be as well.
Well, I want to go back to the earlier comment that Mr. Barak made. I agree with much of what he said about the Obama administration, but it's a mistake to conflate support for Israel with the positions of the Christian Zionists and the right wing of the American Jewish community. The people I'm part of, the organizations I'm part of, are also supportive of Israel, and we believe, again, it's in Israel's interest to get rid of the settlements, to disband them, and end this occupation, which is both a moral and a strategic disaster for Israel, the Palestinian people, and the Americans. So when we constantly talk about pro-Israel, support for Israel, it's a simplistic notion to say that just means support for the right-wing policies of a Likud government. Second of all, the notion that evangelical Christians are sort of part of the support base for Israel is true, but Barack Obama doesn't much care about that wing of the evangelical community. There's a more centrist, left-leaning evangelical base that supports what he's doing in the Middle East. And most importantly, his democratic base, both Jews and non-Jews, are frankly losing patience with the Israeli occupation and losing patience with what they believe to be Israeli intransigence. And I think that the Israelis need to recognize that the political landscape in America is changing. And American Jews like me are trying to make sure that there's support for Israel's core security requirements and that those are maintained throughout the next decade and beyond. It's becoming more and more difficult for us to do that, however, given the hostility that's beginning to build.
Okay, well, we're going to take a very short break here, gentlemen. We'll back to you both in a moment. Now, as we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We're taking a poll in there now asking, have the efforts of America's pro-Israel lobby made Israel more or less secure? Tell us what you think, and we'll have the results just after the break. Stay tuned.
Dum